The air atop the Obersalzberg was always thinner, sharper, and smelled perpetually of ancient pine and the coming of snow. It was a rarefied atmosphere, not merely because of the elevation of the Bavarian Alps, but because of the power that resided there. In the early 1940s, as the shadow of the swastika lengthened across the map of Europe, a generation of children lived within a sanctuary of absolute silence, while the soot of industrial war began to coat the cities of the Ruhr and the mud of the Eastern Front swallowed divisions whole. The children of the Nazi elite played in gardens that felt like the very edge of the world. For them, the war was not a matter of casualty lists or caloric deficits. It was a distant thunder, a background noise easily ignored amidst the clinking of fine porcelain and the soft rustle of starched linen. At the Berghof, Hitler's Alpine retreat, the weather dictated the mood of the Reich. On clear days, the Untersberg mountain loomed with a crystalline clarity, its jagged peaks reflecting a sun that seemed to favor the new masters of Germany. The children of high-ranking officials, the Speers, the Bormanns, the Goebbels brood, ran through alpine meadows, their laughter echoing against the stone walls of a fortress that was meant to stand for a millennium. To these children, the men who sat in smoke-filled rooms deciding the fate of nations were not monsters of history. They were simply Papa. Heinrich Himmler was not the architect of the final solution to young Gudrun. He was the man who sent her Edelweiss from the front and called her Puppi. Reinhard Heydrich was not the hangman of Prague to his sons. He was a champion fencer and a talented violinist who played lullabies in the evening. However, this innocence was a curated product, a manufactured reality sustained by the blood of a continent. The golden cage was reinforced by a thick veil of domesticity that masked the machinery of death. In the Speer household, the children lived in a world of architectural drawings and grand models of Germania, a city of marble that would never be built. They saw their father as a creator, a man of stone and vision, never smelling the sweat of the slave laborers who carved that stone in the quarries of Mauthausen. The sensory density of their lives was defined by the smell of expensive tobacco, the warmth of the hearth, and the soft fur of the German shepherds that prowled the perimeter. They were the center of a new aristocracy, groomed to inherit a world where their surnames would be the ultimate currency. The contrast between the macro and the micro during these years was a study in profound irony. On the general's map, the arrows pushed toward the Volga and the Nile, representing the movement of millions of men into the meat grinder of total war. But in the nursery, the focus was on the texture of a wooden toy or the taste of a fresh strawberry, delicacies that were becoming memories for the rest of Germany. The children were the living proof of the master race theory, blonde, blue-eyed and healthy, their bodies honed by the mountain air and their minds filled with the heroic sagas of the North. They were taught that they were special, not by merit, but by blood, a philosophy that wrapped them in a cloak of perceived invincibility. As the years progressed, and the tide of war began its slow, inevitable retreat, the silence of the Obersalzberg became heavier. The pivot of history began to turn. The clear mountain air was increasingly punctuated by the distant drone of Allied bomber streams, silver specks in the high blue yonder that signaled the end of the sanctuary. The fathers stayed away longer. The mothers grew more brittle, their smiles tighter as they listened to the radio reports that spoke of strategic withdrawals. The children sensed the shift, not through political understanding, but through the atmospheric pressure of the home. The warmth of the golden cage was cooling. The smell of pine was being replaced by the metallic tang of fear. They did not know that the names they carried, Goering, Frank, Hess, Ribbentrop, were becoming synonymous with the greatest crimes in human history. They did not know that the palaces they inhabited were built on the foundations of a graveyard. To be a child of the Nazi elite was to live in a dream state, a curated hallucination of peace while the world outside was being torn asunder. They were the heirs to a Götterdämmerung they could not yet comprehend, standing on the balcony of history, watching the sunset of an empire and mistaking it for the dawn. Today, the foundations of the Berghof are overgrown with weeds, and the mountain air is once again just air, stripped of its political charge. But for those children, the golden cage was the only world they knew, a world that was about to shatter into a million jagged pieces of glass. The morning sun over the Bavarian Alps in 1941 did not just bring light, it brought a sense of divine right. For the children of the Nazi High Command, the day began with the sensory ritual of order, the sharp snap of starched cotton, the smell of beeswax on polished floors, and the rhythmic, distant crunch of jackboots on gravel. The weather was often a character in itself, a relentless crystalline blue that suggested a world where the shadows had been permanently banished by the brilliance of the new order. Within the walls of their mountain villas and city palaces, these children were being subjected to a pedagogy of privilege, a systematic grooming designed to produce the masters of a continent they were told was their birthright. On the macro level, the Reich's educational strategy was a pincer movement aimed at the soul of the next generation. The goal was Gleichschaltung, the total coordination of mind and spirit. While the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls absorbed millions of ordinary children into a collective of marching and campfire songs, the children of the elite were being prepared for something more refined. They were the thoroughbreds of the movement. For them, the ideology was not just a subject in school, it was the air they breathed. They were taught that the world was a hierarchy of blood, and they sat at its absolute apex. Their fathers were not merely administrators, they were the titans of a new age, and the children were the living proof of the Aryan ideal. However, the micro-reality of this upbringing was often one of stifling clinical perfection. In the Himmler household, young Gudrun, the Reichsführer's beloved Puepi, was raised under a regime of Anstand, a term encompassing decency, discipline, and absolute self-control. Her father, a man who meticulously organized the industrialization of death on a continental scale, was equally obsessed with the minutiae of his daughter's life. Her grades were scrutinized as if they were production quotas. Her posture was corrected as if it were a military formation. The sensory density of her world was defined by the scratchy texture of traditional Bavarian wool and the cold, clean scent of the mountain air she was told made her blood stronger. She was taught that to be an elite was to be a servant to the race, a philosophy that turned her childhood into a beautiful high-altitude training camp. The philosophical echo of this education was profound. It taught the children that empathy was a weakness and that history belonged to the strong. In the nurseries of the High Command, the macro to micro zoom revealed a terrifying disconnect. On the wall, a map might show the expansive Lebensraum being carved out in the east, while on the floor, the children played with wooden soldiers representing the very men who were carrying out mass executions. They were taught to see the Untermensch, the subhuman, not as people, but as obstacles to be cleared, much like the weeds in their meticulously tended gardens. The pivot of history lay in the fact that these children were being prepared for a world that required them to be monsters, yet they were being tucked into bed by men who wept at the sound of a violin. As the war entered its middle years, the pedagogy shifted from the triumphalist to the sacrificial. The atmosphere grew heavier, the mountain mists lingering longer in the valleys. The children were no longer just the masters of the future, they were to be the guardians of the Reich's honor. In the elite Napola schools, the sons of the leadership were put through trials of endurance that mirrored the brutality of the front. They were taught that to die for the Führer was the ultimate graduation. The smell of wood smoke and the taste of thin wartime broth began to permeate even the most privileged households, a subtle reminder that the millennium promised to them was already fraying at the edges. They were a generation raised in a vacuum, isolated from the soot of the crematoria and the screams of the occupied. Their privilege was a wall of glass, clear enough to see the world, but thick enough to distort it entirely. They did not know that the very education meant to make them invincible was actually a sentence of lifelong psychological exile. They were being taught how to rule a world that was, even as they learned their lessons, being burned to the ground by their own fathers. Today, the textbooks they read are artifacts of a madness that once pretended to be science. But in the early 1940s, that pedagogy was the most powerful weapon in the Nazi arsenal, the attempt to colonize the future through the hearts of its children. In the autumn of 1942, the city of Krakow was a place of suffocating, damp greyness. Mist rose from the Vistula River, coiling around the base of the Wawel Hill like a serpent, obscuring medieval spires and ancient stone walls that had stood for centuries. For the Polish people, the air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and the metallic tang of fear. But atop the hill, in the grand halls of the Wawel Castle, the atmosphere was one of stolen majesty. This was the seat of Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, a man who styled himself as the King of Poland, and who oversaw a regime of such systematic plunder and slaughter that even some of his fellow Nazis found him excessive. In the midst of this royal delusion lived his young son, Niklas Frank, a boy who would grow up to become the most ferocious prosecutor of his own blood. On the macro level, the general government was a laboratory for the most brutal aspects of the Third Reich. It was the dumping ground for the unwanted, the site of the most notorious ghettos, and the eventual location of the death camps. Hans Frank's map was not one of borders, but of quotas: how many tons of grain to extract, how many laborers to deport, and how many lives to extinguish to create a Germanized East. He sat in his office surrounded by looted masterpieces, including Leonardo da Vinci's Lady with an Ermine, treating the cultural heritage of a nation as his personal plaything. From the ramparts of the Wawel, he could look out over a kingdom of misery, convinced that he was the architect of a new, glorious civilization. However, the micro-story of Niklas Frank reveals a domestic life that was as hollow as it was opulent. To Niklas, the Wawel was not a palace. It was a cold, labyrinthine world of echoes. He remembers the sensory density of those years, the smell of heavy, dark wood furniture, the velvet curtains that seemed to swallow the light, and the distant, rhythmic clicking of his father's secretary's typewriter. He saw his father not as a statesman, but as a man obsessed with his own image, a narcissist who would spend hours preening in front of mirrors while signing death warrants. The boy lived in a state of constant, quiet observation, watching the king navigate his stolen domain. He remembers the lady with an ermine hanging on the wall, a stolen beauty that seemed to stare back at the family with a silent, judging gaze. The philosophical echo of Niklas's childhood is one of profound, corrosive guilt. Unlike many other children of the Nazi elite who would spend their post-war lives making excuses or clinging to happy memories, Niklas would eventually choose to burn the bridge to his past. He reflected on the silence of the castle, a silence bought with the screams of the Krakow ghetto, located just a short distance across the river. While the Frank family ate off silver plates, the children in the Podgorza district were starving. Niklas remembered the luxury, but he interpreted it through the lens of the horror that funded it. He famously carried a photo of his father's bloated, executed corpse in his pocket, not as a memento of love, but as a reminder of what happens when a man loses his soul to power. As the Red Army began its relentless surge from the east in late 1944, the atmosphere in the Wawel turned from arrogant to frantic. The humidity of the Polish summer gave way to a biting, prophetic winter. The stolen art was crated. The king prepared his escape. The children were bundled into cars, fleeing the kingdom that was collapsing into fire and rubble. Nicholas remembers the panic, the smell of exhaust fumes in the cold air, and the realization that the 1,000-year reign had lasted barely 5. The transition from the Wawel castle to a cell in Nuremberg was for Hans Frank a fall of Shakespearean proportions. For Nicholas, it was the beginning of a lifelong reckoning. Today, flowers grow in the courtyards of the Wawel, and the lady with an ermine has returned to the Polish people. But Nicholas Frank remains a man haunted by the geography of his youth. He has written books that are essentially autopsies of his father's character, refusing to grant the man the mercy of being remembered as just a father. He understands that in the shadow of the Wawel, there was no such thing as an innocent childhood. The earth of Krakow remembers the blood, and Nicholas Frank, the son of the butcher, ensures that the world never forgets the man who spilled it. In the summer of 1943, the humidity in the marshlands of Upper Silesia was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Near the confluence of the Vistula and Sola rivers, the air hung still, thick with the scent of damp earth, stagnant water, and a third, more pervasive odor, a sweet, sickly, cloying smell that the locals called the bakery, though everyone knew there was no bread being baked. In this oppressive heat, a small 2-story house stood just outside the concrete walls of a sprawling industrial complex. This was the residence of the Hoss family. To the world, Auschwitz would become the definitive map coordinate of human depravity. But to young Brigitte Hoss and her 4 siblings, it was simply home. On the macro level, Auschwitz was undergoing its final, most lethal evolution. Rudolf Hoss, the camp commandant and the children's father, was the ultimate technocrat of terror. He did not see himself as a murderer, but as a logistics expert. His task was the efficient processing of units. While he sat in his office refining the schedules of the Reichsbahn trains and calculating the sublimation rates of Zyklon B, he was also a man who took pride in his domestic stability. The commandant's house was a reward for his efficiency, a colonial outpost on the frontier of the new order. From his perspective, the camp was a machine, and he was the master mechanic, ensuring it ran without friction. However, the micro-story of life inside that house is a study in the most profound sensory cognitive dissonance. The Hoss Garden was a marvel of the region, a lush green oasis where Hedwig Hoss, Brigitte's mother, spent her days cultivating prize-winning strawberries and roses. There was a small swimming pool where the children splashed and laughed, the sound of their play drifting over the barbed wire fences just 200 meters away. Brigitte remembers a childhood of sunshine and pets, of a father who was the loveliest man in the world, who would read them stories and take them on boat rides on the Sola River. They lived in a paradise, as Hedwig called it, seemingly oblivious to the fact that their paradise was built on the ashes of 1 million souls. The turning point of their existence was literally written in the atmosphere. The weather in Auschwitz was never truly clear. A fine grey dust often fell from the sky, coating the leaves of the strawberries and the surface of the pool water. It was the ash of the crematoria. Hedwig would tell the children to shake the dust off before they ate, treating the remnants of human beings as if it were nothing more than bothersome soot from a passing locomotive. The sensory density of their lives was a grotesque collage. The smell of expensive French perfumes looted from the Canada warehouses where prisoners' belongings were sorted, mixed with the stench of the pits. The children played with toys expertly carved by prisoner craftsmen, men whose names they never knew and whose lives were forfeit the moment their labor was no longer required. Philosophically, the story of Brigitte Hoss challenges our understanding of the human heart. How can a man oversee the industrial slaughter of thousands in the morning and tenderly tuck his daughter into bed at night? The greenhouse of Auschwitz was a controlled environment where empathy was surgically removed from the family unit. Brigitte would carry this compartmentalization for the rest of her life. Even decades later, living quietly in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. under an assumed name, she would struggle to reconcile the loving father with the mass murderer. She lived in the shadow of a greenhouse that had been fed by the nutrients of death, a child who had breathed in the smoke of the Holocaust and called it home. As the Red Army approached in 1945, the humid Polish summer gave way to a biting, desperate winter. The garden froze, the pool was drained, and the Hoss family fled into the chaos of a collapsing Germany. Paradise was abandoned to the ghosts. Today, the commandant's house still stands, a silent witness to the banality of evil. The strawberries no longer grow there, but the earth remembers the ash. For Brigitte, the scars of history were not just metaphorical, they were the very air of her youth, a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often those who come home to kiss their children goodnight. The air in the Brazilian coastal town of Bertioga was a thick, wet wool that clung to the skin, heavy with the scent of salt spray and rotting vegetation. In 1977, the humidity was an oppressive presence, a physical weight that seemed to trap the heat against the earth. For the old man living in a modest bungalow under the name Jose Mengele, the tropical climate was a far cry from the clinical, sterile cold of the laboratories at Auschwitz. He was a shadow of the man who had once stood on the ramparts of the death camp, deciding with a flick of his thumb who would live and who would burn. He was now a fugitive, a non-person whose existence was a secret guarded by a dwindling circle of loyalists. Into this humid purgatory came his son, Rolf, a man carrying the heaviest name in the world, seeking a reckoning with a father he barely knew. Mengele. On the macro level, the search for Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death, was the most high-stakes game of hide-and-seek in the post-war era. For decades, Mossad agents and Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal scoured the globe, tracking leads from the pampas of Argentina to the jungles of Paraguay. The map of Mengele's flight was a study in the breakdown of international justice. He had slipped through the fingers of the Allies in 1945, hiding as a simple farmhand in Bavaria before utilizing the ratlines of Europe to reach South America in 1949. He had lived a life of mundane anonymity in Buenos Aires, working as a carpenter and a salesman, always staying one step ahead of the vengeance that he knew was coming. He became the ultimate symbol of the unpunished Nazi, a ghost who mocked the memory of his victims by simply continuing to breathe. Unpunished. However, the micro-story of Rolf Mengele reveals the psychological carnage left behind by such a legacy. Rolf had grown up in West Germany in a vacuum of truth. He had been told his father was dead, or perhaps a hero, until the veil was slowly pulled back by the whispers of history. In the late 1950s, a man introduced as Uncle Fritz had accompanied him on a skiing trip in Switzerland, a charming, athletic man who shared a family vacation without ever revealing he was the boy's father. It was not until 1977, arranged through the clandestine logistics of a loyal family lawyer, that Rolf finally traveled to Brazil to confront the man who had become the world's most hunted monster. The sensory density of that meeting was defined by the contrast between Rolf's modern, liberal sensibilities and the unrepentant arrogance of the old man. Rolf. The philosophical echo of their encounter was a clash of two different Germanys. Rolf, who harbored communist leanings and a profound sense of historical guilt, found himself face to face with a man who still believed in the pseudo-science of the master race. The pivot of their relationship was found in the silence of the Brazilian bungalow. Rolf had come seeking an apology, a sign of remorse for the surgeries without anesthesia and the experiments on twins that had made his father's name a curse. Instead, he found a man who was utterly convinced of his own righteousness, a father who looked at his son not with love, but with the cold, analytical detachment of a scientist observing a failed specimen. Josef Mengele did not see a monster in the mirror. He saw a misunderstood pioneer. The weather in Bertioga remained relentless throughout Rolf's stay, the thunderstorms breaking with a violence that mirrored the internal storm within the sun. He walked the beaches with his father, watching the man who had ordered the deaths of hundreds of thousands struggle with the simple infirmities of old age. The silence between them was louder than the crashing surf. Rolf realized that his father was not a titan of evil, but a pathetic, aging man, trapped in a prison of his own making. He left Brazil knowing that the biological bond was the only thing they shared. Silence, he would never understand how a human being could behave as his father had. In 1979, Josef Mengele finally escaped justice for the last time. He suffered a stroke while swimming in the Atlantic and drowned in the very waters where he had once walked with his son. He was buried in an unmarked grave under a false name, a fitting end for a man who had spent half his life as a lie. For Rolf, the death was a release. He officially rejected his inheritance and abandoned the surname Mengele. He chose to live as a lawyer in Munich under a name that did not scream of the crematoria. Today, the beach at Bertioga is a place of tourists and sunshine, but the earth of the unmarked grave nearby remains a silent testament to a son who chose to break the chain of blood. The air in the San Fernando district of Buenos Aires in May 1960 was heavy with the approaching autumn, a damp, clinging humidity that carried the scent of diesel exhaust and charcoal smoke from street vendors. It was a neighborhood of modest, dusty houses and unpaved roads, a world away from the gleaming marble of the new Reich Chancellery. Here, a man known as Ricardo Clement lived a life of quiet, almost invisible routine, working at a Mercedes-Benz factory and tending to his modest garden. Among his children was his youngest son Ricardo, a boy of 5 who knew his father only as a still but present figure of the household. He did not know that his father was Adolf Eichmann, the logistics expert of the Holocaust, the man who had translated the madness of the Wannsee Conference into the cold, hard reality of train schedules and death counts. On the macro level, the capture of Adolf Eichmann, Operation Garibaldi, was the moment the post-war world finally forced the Third Reich to look in the mirror. For 15 years, Eichmann had been a ghost, a name whispered in the halls of justice, but a face lost in the crowds of South America. Mossad's operation was a masterclass in clandestine warfare, a surgical strike into the heart of a fugitive sanctuary. The map of his crimes was vast, stretching from the ghettos of Budapest to the ramps of Birkenau. But the map of his capture was a single, dimly lit street, Garibaldi Street, where the architect of the final solution was tackled into the mud by men whose families he had destroyed. Yet, the micro-story of young Ricardo Eichmann is one of a sudden, violent vacuum. One evening, his father simply did not come home. The sensory density of that period for the young boy was defined by the confused whispers of his mother and the older brothers, the flickering light of the kerosene lamps during power outages, and the sudden, terrifying arrival of the world's press. For Ricardo, the architect was not a monster. He was a void. while his older brothers Klaus, Horst and Dieter clung to a legacy of defiance, joining neo-Nazi groups and defending their father's duty, young Ricardo was left to piece together the truth from the very history books that condemned his bloodline. He was the child of a man who had turned murder into a filing system, and he would spend his life digging through the layers of the past to find a truth that did not taste like ash. The philosophical echo of Ricardo's life is found in his choice of profession, archaeology. While his father built a world of ephemeral industrial death, Ricardo chose to study the ancient, the stone, and the silent ruins of the Near East. He became a man of the earth, but in a way that sought to preserve rather than destroy. He famously stated that he could find no common ground with the man who was his father, choosing to view Adolf Eichmann not as a parent, but as a historical specimen of human failure. The pivot of his existence was his refusal to inherit the hate. He chose the silence of the desert and the precision of the trowel over the loud, hollow rhetoric of his brothers. As the trial in Jerusalem progressed in 1961, the atmospheric pressure on the family in Argentina became unbearable. The weather seemed to reflect the heat of the international spotlight, a relentless sun that exposed every hiding place. Ricardo watched from a distance as his father sat in a glass booth, looking not like a titan of evil, but like a clerk, a banal man, as Hannah Arendt famously wrote. The realization that the man who had held him as a toddler was responsible for the systematic slaughter of 6 million people was a psychological earthquake. Ricardo did not seek to explain it away. He did not seek to justify the orders. He simply stepped out of the shadow and into the light of his own making. Today, Ricardo Eichmann is a respected scholar, a man who has contributed more to the understanding of ancient civilizations than his father did to the 1,000-year one he tried to build. He lives in a world of quiet academic rigor, far from the humid streets of San Fernando. But the scars of history remain. He is the living proof that blood is not destiny. While the earth remembers the trains and the camps, it also remembers the son who looked at the architect's shadow and decided to walk toward the sun. In the early 1930s, the Bavarian sky above Tegernsee was a deep, impossible blue, and the air carried the scent of mown hay and the sharp, clean ozone of the mountains. It was here that a young girl with blonde braids, dressed in traditional dirndls, spent her summers in a state of grace. She was Puppy, the doll, to the man the world knew as the Reichsführer of the SS. To Gudrun Himmler, Heinrich Himmler was not the pedantic mass murderer who managed the logistics of the gas chambers. He was the father who took her to see the herbs in the garden at Dachau, treating the concentration camp like a suburban nursery. She saw order and purity, but she never looked at the shadows behind the wire. On the macro level, the SS was the black heart of the Nazi state, an organization built on the cult of the elite and the systematic erasure of inferior life. Heinrich Himmler was its high priest, a man who believed he was breeding a new race of Germanic knights. His map was one of biological warfare and ancestral heritage, a grand, dark vision of a continent cleansed of impurities. He was the most powerful man in the Reich after Hitler, a bureaucrat of terror who moved millions to their deaths with the stroke of a fountain pen. But on the micro level, he was a doting, obsessive father who sent his daughter pressed flowers from the front lines and wrote letters filled with mundane domestic advice. The pivot in Gudrun's story is not one of realization or remorse, but of a chilling, lifelong defiance. Unlike the Frank or Eichmann children, Gudrun Himmler never broke the spell of the golden cage. When the war ended and her father committed suicide with a cyanide capsule in British custody, the atmosphere of her world did not clear. It curdled. She viewed his death not as the end of a criminal, but as the martyrdom of a hero. The sensory density of her post-war life was defined by the cold, cramped quarters of Allied internment camps and the grey, silent bitterness of a Germany trying to forget. But Gudrun refused to forget. She became the unrepentant priestess, a living bridge to the era of the swastika. Philosophically, Gudrun represents the most dangerous form of memory, the memory that preserves the lie. For decades, she was the driving force behind Stille Hilfe, an organization dedicated to providing legal and financial support to former SS members and fugitives. She became the princess of the old comrades, moving through the shadows of West German society with a quiet, regal authority. While the rest of the world looked at the photos of the liberated camps in horror, Gudrun looked at the photos of her father and saw only a misunderstood visionary. She lived in a sensory bubble, where the smell of the mountain air at Tegernsee never faded, even as the world around her turned to concrete and glass. The weather of her later years was one of a perpetual self-imposed winter. She lived in a modest suburb of Munich, a ghost in a raincoat, attending neo-Nazi rallies and keeping the flame of her father's ideology alive in the dark. She was a woman who had seen the evidence of the Holocaust and decided it was a fabrication of the victors. Her loyalty became a weapon, a refusal to acknowledge the blood on her father's hands. To her, the scars of history were not the craters in Berlin, but the loss of the world she had been promised as a child. Gudrun Himmler died in 2018, taking her secrets and her lack of remorse to the grave. She remains a haunting figure in the saga of the Nazi heirs, the daughter who stayed in the garden while the house burned down, and who spent the rest of her life trying to rebuild the walls. Today, the herbs at Dachau are gone, replaced by monuments to the dead, but the story of the unrepentant princess serves as a reminder that for some, the darkness of the past is the only light they are willing to see. The morning of June 2nd, 1938, was bathed in a triumphant golden light that seemed to mirror the absolute confidence of the Third Reich. Across Germany, the air was filled with the rhythmic iron clang of church bells, not tolling for a funeral, but ringing in celebration of a birth that the Ministry of Propaganda had elevated to a national event. At the West Sanatorium Clinic in Berlin, Edda Goering was brought into a world of curated majesty. More than 628,000 congratulatory telegrams flooded the Goering household, a staggering mountain of paper that represented the calculated adoration of a nation. Her father, Hermann Goering, the Reichsmarschall, the chief of the Luftwaffe, and the man designated as Hitler's heir, was at the summit of his power. To the world, he was a flamboyant warlord. To young Edda, he was the man who provided a childhood of unimaginable, stolen grace. On the macro level, the birth of the Princess of the Third Reich was the ultimate branding exercise for the regime. It projected stability, lineage, and a sense of aristocratic permanence. Her godfather was none other than Adolf Hitler, the man who held the map of Europe in his hands and was already drawing the arrows of invasion. The relationship was intimate, and Hitler showed a genuine, rare affection for the toddler, welcoming her with open arms as she took her first steps across the marble floors of the Chancellery. The godfather's gift was not just the dolls and boxes of chocolates he gave her every new year, but the entire world he was building for her. A world where her surname would command the same reverence as the royal houses of old. However, the micro-reality of Edda's childhood was a sensory immersion in the most monumental plunder in human history. Her home was Karinhall, a vast hunting lodge palace built in the ancient forests of Schorfheide. The air there smelled of cedar, damp earth, and the faint, expensive scent of the cigars her father smoked as he walked through his private galleries. Karinhall was a fortress of art, housing a collection that was staggering in its administrative arrogance. 1,400 paintings, 250 sculptures, and thousands of rare books. As a young girl, Edda ran through halls lined with antique tapestries and Persian carpets, her laughter echoing past masterpieces by Cranach and Rembrandt that had been systematically stripped from the museums and private collections of occupied Europe. For her christening, she received a gift that would define her post-war struggle: The Virgin and Child by Lucas Cranach the Elder, a painting donated by the Cologne City Council, but originally looted from a museum. To Edda, these were not artifacts of theft. They were the wallpaper of her nursery. The reversal of history arrived in 1945 with the sound of Allied engines and the smell of smoke. The golden light of 1938 had been replaced by a grey, ash-laden sky as the Red Army closed in on Berlin. Karinhall, the sanctuary of stolen beauty, was wired with explosives and detonated by Goering's retreating troops to prevent it from falling into Soviet hands. The transition for Edda was violent and absolute. The princess was cast out of the palace and into a world where her father was no longer a titan, but a prisoner in a cell at Nuremberg. The sensory density of her life shifted from the velvet of Karinhall to the cold, cramped rooms of post-war internment. She watched from the sidelines as the Godfather's gift, the Reich itself, was dismantled, and her father cheated the gallows with a cyanide capsule, leaving her with nothing but a name that the world had decided to erase. Philosophically, Edda Goering's life became a decades-long exercise in the persistence of entitlement. Unlike the children who sought to atone for their fathers, Edda Goering remained a princess in exile. For the rest of her life, she moved through the high society of Munich, living in the Lehel district and maintaining ties with circles that remain nostalgic for the era of the swastika. Her battle was not with her father's conscience, but with the Bavarian authorities over his inheritance. She litigated for years to reclaim the Cranach painting, arguing that it had been a personal christening gift rather than a piece of state plunder. In her mind, the Godfather's gift was a legal right, an inheritance that the victors had no authority to take. The Federal Court of Germany disagreed, ruling in 1968 that the acquisition was immoral, but Edda never stopped fighting for the material remnants of her youth. Today, the ruins of Karinhall are overgrown with the same forest that once witnessed its majesty. The foundations are hidden beneath a carpet of moss and pine needles, and the air is once again just the air of the Schorfheide. But Edda Goering lived until her death in 2018 as a woman caught between the privilege of the past and the ruin of the present. She was the child who sat on the lap of the world's most powerful monster and never looked at his claws. She inherited a world of stolen grace and spent her final years trying to reclaim a single piece of the beauty that was built on the blood of a continent. In the spring of 1945, the atmosphere in Berlin was no longer composed of air, but of a choking, abrasive mixture of pulverized brick, the cordite of Katyusha rockets, and the heavy, sweet scent of unburied corpses. The sky was a permanent bruised purple, lit from below by the orange flickering of a city in its death throes. Deep beneath the shattered garden of the old Reich Chancellery, the humidity of the Führer bunker was a living thing, a damp, recycled warmth that carried the smell of diesel oil, floor wax, and the clinical metallic tang of the oxygen scrubbers. In this subterranean tomb, 6 children, the Goebbels brood, spent their final days playing in narrow hallways, unaware that their mother Magda had already decided their 1,000-year future would end in a small vial of cyanide. But there was a 7th child, a survivor of this doomed dynasty, who was a world away from the concrete walls. On the macro level, the Goebbels family had been the aesthetic heartbeat of the Third Reich. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, understood that the Reich needed a soul as much as it needed a sword. His 6 children, all with names beginning with H in honor of the Führer, were the first family of National Socialism. They were filmed for newsreels, their blonde hair and bright eyes used to sell the dream of a racial utopia. They were the ultimate propaganda tool, proof that the Nazi elite were not just cold administrators, but loving parents building a world for the next generation. The map of their lives was meant to be the map of a new Europe. However, the micro-story of Harold Quandt is the pivot of the entire Goebbels saga. Harold was Magda's son from her first marriage to the industrialist Gunther Quandt. While his half-siblings were being tucked into bed in the bunker, the 23-year-old Harold was in a British prisoner of war camp in Benghazi, Libya. The weather there was a fierce, scouring heat, a dry desert wind that tasted of sand and salt, a stark contrast to the damp cold of the Berlin underground. In late May 1945, Harold received a letter that would become the most heavy artifact of his life. It was a farewell from his mother, written in the bunker just days before she murdered her children and took her own life. "My dear son," she wrote, the ink likely smeared by the humidity of the tomb, "the world that comes after the Führer and National Socialism is not worth living in, and therefore I have taken the children with me. They are too good for the life that would follow." The philosophical echo of Harold's survival is one of a profound, isolating silence. He was the one who was spared by the coincidence of capture. While the world watched the grainy footage of his siblings' bodies being carried out of the bunker, Harold had to reconcile the mother who had loved him with the woman who had systematically poisoned her own children to save them from a world without Hitler. The sensory density of his post-war life was defined by the transition from the uniform of a Luftwaffe lieutenant to the tailored suits of an industrial titan. Harold and his half-brother Herbert Quandt inherited the vast family business empire, an empire built in no small part on the forced labor of concentration camp prisoners and the manufacturing of the very batteries that powered U-boats and V-2 rockets. As the 1950s arrived, the scars of history took the form of steel and capital. Harold became one of the wealthiest men in West Germany, a key figure in the economic miracle. He oversaw the growth of BMW and the expansion of the Quandt holdings, turning a legacy of blood into a legacy of industry. Yet the macro-micro zoom of his life remained jarring. In the boardroom, he was the architect of modern German capitalism. In his private thoughts, he was the boy who had lost 6 siblings to a madness he had once served. He never spoke publicly about the bunker. He lived in a state of high-velocity avoidance, a man who flew his own planes and drove fast cars, as if trying to outrun the shadow of the Goebbels surname. The weather of Harold's end was a stormy night in 1967. His private aircraft crashed into a mountainside in the Italian Alps, a return to the high-altitude silence of his youth. Today, the Quandt family remains one of the most powerful dynasties in the world, their name synonymous with luxury and precision. But the earth beneath the BMW factories and the silence of the Alpine crash site serve as reminders of the 7th child. Harold Quandt survived the bunker, but he spent the rest of his life navigating the ruins of a family that had chosen death over a reality they could not control. He was the survivor of a Götterdämmerung that had claimed everyone but him, a man whose fortune was built on the remains of a world that his mother had tried to burn to the ground. The air in the Ruhr Valley during the height of the 1940s was never truly clear. It was a heavy, sulphurous canopy, a permanent twilight of soot and iron filings that tasted of grit and scorched metal. This was the beating, blackened heart of the German war machine, where the horizon was a jagged line of smokestacks and the earth vibrated with the relentless rhythmic thud of steam hammers. In the grand villas nestled just far enough from the blast furnaces to avoid the thickest grime, The children of the industrial titans lived in a world of polished mahogany and silent servants. They were the heirs of names like Krupp, Flick, Quandt, and Porsche, names that would outlast the Reich, carrying the weight of the 1,000-year labor into a new democratic age. On the macro level, the relationship between the Nazi state and the industrial elite was a marriage of blood and iron. The generals drew the lines on the map, but the industrialists provided the ink. Companies like IG Farben, Krupp, and Flick were the Wehrwirtschaftsführer, the leaders of the defense economy. Their map was not one of borders, but of resources: the iron ore of Sweden, the coal of Silesia, and the human material provided by the SS. While the fathers sat in boardrooms discussing production quotas, they were simultaneously overseeing a system of industrial slavery that turned the concentration camps into satellite factories. The macro view was one of staggering efficiency. The micro view was a nightmare of starvation and exhaustion, where a human life was valued at less than the cost of the fuel used to transport it. The pivot of this chapter lies in the persistence of capital. When the smoke cleared in 1945, the political leaders went to the gallows or took the coward's way out with cyanide, but the industrial dynasties proved far more resilient. The children of these men, Friedrich Christian Flick, the Quandt siblings, and the heirs of Ferdinand Porsche inherited empires that were technically in ruins but structurally intact. The sensory density of their transition was defined by the silence of the 1950s. While Germany rebuilt, a veil was drawn over the fact that the economic miracle was funded by the profits of total war. Friedrich Christian Flick, who would later become one of the world's greatest art collectors, inherited a fortune that his father, Friedrich Flick, had built through the Aryanization of Jewish properties and the brutal exploitation of 40,000 slave laborers. To the heir, the money was a tool for culture. To the victims, it was the currency of their suffering. Philosophically, these heirs represent the long memory of the machine. They were raised to believe in the sanctity of the family business, a pedagogy that often required them to compartmentalize the source of their wealth. The weather of the post-war years was a mild, forgetful spring. The soot was washed off the villas, and the factory floors were scrubbed clean of the blood. But the macro-micro zoom remains haunting. Today, a person can drive a car, use a battery, or visit a gallery, and unknowingly touch the legacy of a man who worked himself to death in a Krupp quarry. The heirs often lived in a state of defensive philanthropy, using their vast fortunes to build foundations and museums as if trying to buy a different version of history. The scars of history in the industrial world are often hidden behind glass and steel. In the Quandt family, it took decades for the younger generation to force an investigation into their father's wartime activities, the pedagogy of privilege finally giving way to a pedagogy of truth. They discovered that the batteries powering modern convenience were descendants of the batteries that had powered the U-boats, built by men who died of lead poisoning in the camps. The irony is sharp. The very products that symbolized German quality and reliability were forged in an era of absolute moral collapse. Today, the Ruhr is greener, the smokestacks are fewer, and the air is cleaner. But beneath the prosperity of the modern German state lies a foundation of coal and steel that remains cold to the touch. The industrial heirs are the stewards of a complicated ghost. They carry the gold of the golden cage, but they also carry the ledger of the factory floor. They remind us that while regimes fall and borders shift, the machine and the families who own it often find a way to keep turning, grinding the bones of the past into the progress of the future. In the spring of 1945, the climate of Germany underwent a violent, schizophrenic shift. The orchards of the south were beginning to bloom, a cruel and indifferent display of white and pink blossoms that mocked the blackened landscape. But the air did not smell of spring. It smelled of Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods. It was a sensory cocktail of wet ash, the ozone of endless electrical fires, and the pervasive, chalky dust of pulverized limestone that seemed to coat every throat. The golden cage had not just opened, it had been blasted apart. For the children of the Nazi elite, the transition from the rarefied air of Obersalzberg to the subterranean damp of bunkers and the frantic, mud-clogged roads of the retreat was the ultimate climax of their young lives. The world was no longer a map of conquests, it was a shrinking circle of fire. On the macro level, the Reich was experiencing a total systemic failure. The general's map had become a chaotic mess of pockets and cauldrons. Divisions existed only on paper, and the supply lines that once fed the continent were now nothing more than horse-drawn carts struggling through the slush of a melting winter. Hitler's Nero decree called for the destruction of everything, factories, bridges, even the very infrastructure of German life, to ensure the victors inherited nothing but a desert. While the radio still spat out defiant rhetoric of final victory, the reality was a frantic migration of the high command. Families were bundled into Mercedes-Benz cars, their trunks filled with looted silver and furs, fleeing toward the Alpine Redoubt, a mythical mountain fortress that existed more in the imagination of the propaganda ministry than in military reality. However, the micro-story of this collapse was found in the wide, terrified eyes of the children. For the Speer children, the hour zero arrived not as a single moment, but as a series of sensory shocks. They were moved from the mountain air to the cramped, kerosene-scented darkness of air raid shelters. They watched as their mothers burned family photos and documents in the fireplace, the smell of charred pine and old leather filling the rooms. The architect's children, who had been raised on models of marble cities, now saw only the architecture of ruin. They saw the master race reduced to Trümmer Frauen, the rubble women, and old men of the Volkssturm clutching rusted rifles. The philosophical echo of this moment was the absolute bankruptcy of the pedagogy of privilege. Everything they had been told was their birthright was being reclaimed by the earth. The atmospheric pressure of the final days was suffocating. In the south, the humidity of the Alpine valleys trapped the sound of the approaching Allied artillery, a low, rhythmic growl that never stopped. The children were no longer princes and princesses. They were refugees with dangerous last names. They were hidden in remote farmhouses, their identities scrubbed away, told to keep their mouths shut and their heads down. The weather of the collapse was a grey, weeping rain that turned the roads into rivers of grey silt. When the news finally came, the suicide in the bunker and the surrender at Rams, the silence that followed was louder than any shelling. It was the silence of a vacuum. The ideology that had filled their world was gone, leaving behind a hollow space that would take a lifetime to fill. The pivot of the collapse was the sudden, brutal arrival of the truth. As the Allied soldiers moved in, they brought with them the cameras and the journalists, exposing the world of the camps that the children had lived so close to. The sensory density of their new reality was the smell of GI tobacco, the taste of chocolate from a conqueror's hand, and the sight of the newsreels in the denazification camps. They were forced to watch footage of the pits and the ovens, the faces of their fathers staring back at them from posters that read, "Wanted and listed war criminals." The golden cage was replaced by a prison of historical guilt. They were children of the sun who had been cast into an eternal moral winter. Today, the 8th of May, is remembered as a day of liberation, But for the heirs of the Third Reich, it was the day the earth opened up and swallowed their identity. They stood in the ruins of their palaces, their pockets empty and their names a curse, realizing that the 1,000-year promise had been a lie forged in a furnace. The collapse was total, physical, political, and spiritual. As the first flowers of a post-war summer began to push through the rubble, the children of the elite were left to wonder if they were the survivors of a tragedy or the remnants of a crime. The air in modern-day Germany carries a different weight than it did in the humid summers of the 1940s. It is an air of scrubbed glass, of recycled rain, and of a quiet, industrious peace that seems designed to insulate the soul from the jagged edges of the past. In the center of Berlin, where the concrete of the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe rises in a grey, undulating sea of stone, the wind whistles through the narrow corridors with a low, mournful frequency. Here, the atmosphere is heavy with a chosen silence, not the silence of the golden cage, but the silence of a reckoning that has taken 80 years to articulate. For the heirs of the Third Reich, the scars of history are not merely found in the museums or the history books. They are etched into the very synapses of their identity, a psychological inheritance that no amount of philanthropy or name-changing can fully erase. On the macro level, the aftermath of the Nazi era created a generational vacuum. For decades, West Germany lived through the Great Silence, a period where the weather of the national psyche was a frozen, impenetrable winter. The parents did not speak of what they did, and the children did not ask what they saw. The map of Germany was rebuilt with clinical precision, the rubble cleared by the Trümmerfrauen and replaced by the geometric lines of the economic miracle. But beneath the asphalt and the autobahns, the macro to micro zoom reveals a landscape of trauma. The children of the elite became the custodians of a darkness they did not create, but were forced to carry. They became the Kriegskinder, the war children, whose early memories of alpine meadows were irrevocably stained by the later discovery of the industrial slaughterhouses their fathers managed. The pivot of this final chapter is the transition from biological legacy to moral choice. We see it in the divergent paths of the children we have followed. Some, like Niklas Frank and Ricardo Eichmann, chose to perform a public autopsy on their fathers' souls, turning their grief into a weapon of truth. They realized that to protect the image of the loving father was to become an accomplice to a mass murderer. Others, like Gudrun Himmler or Edda Goering, retreated into a sensory bunker, clinging to the smell of the pine at Berchtesgaden and the feel of stolen silk, as if those textures could override the stench of the gas chambers. The philosophical echo of their lives is the ultimate question of the saga. Can a child ever truly be free of the blood that flows in their veins? Or is history a circle, forever returning to the point of the original crime? The sensory density of memory today is found in the Stolpersteine, the stumbling stones, the small brass plaques embedded in the sidewalks of European cities. They catch the light on rainy afternoons, forcing the pedestrian to look down and see a name, a date, and a destination: Auschwitz, Sobibor, Treblinka. For the children of the perpetrators, these stones are a constant, physical reminder that their childhood privilege was a zero-sum game played with the lives of others. The weather of the 21st century is one of transparency, a relentless sun that has bleached the excuses of the past. The ruins of the Berghof are now just foundations overgrown with weeds, and the Führerbunker is a nondescript parking lot, yet the psychological topography remains. The earth remembers the weight of the boots, even if the boots are no longer there. As we look at the aging faces of the last surviving children of the Nazi high command, we see the final act of a tragedy that began in the mountain air of Bavaria. Their lives have been a long, slow walk out of the shadow of a Gotterdammerung. They have lived through the collapse of an empire and the birth of a world that views their very names as synonyms for evil. They are the living fossils of a madness that tried to rewrite the future in blood. Their story is a reminder that the most enduring ruins of war are not made of stone or steel, but of memory and the excruciating difficulty of forgiveness, both for the world and for themselves. The saga of the heirs concludes not with a final victory or a total defeat, but with a quiet, persistent vigilance. The names Mengele, Haas, Goering and Goebbels still ripple through the air like a cold draught, a warning of what happens when a generation is raised to believe that their blood makes them gods. The scars remain, throbbing beneath the skin of modern Europe, a testament to the cost of a silence that lasted too long. Today, flowers grow in the craters, and the mountain air of the Obersalzberg is once again just the breath of the pines. The sun sets over a Germany that has learned to live with its ghosts, understanding that while the cage of the past can be opened, the marks of the bars will always remain. The earth remembers, and through the children, so must we.